Dear brothers and sisters, peace be with you. Thank God, it's time to read Bible. Let's continue to read Genesis chapter 42. We will start from verse 21 today. Joseph put his brothers in prison. After 3 days, they were brought back before Joseph. Joseph told them directly, "You had to leave one person here, and the rest could go back with the grain for the famine of your house. But bring your youngest brother next time you come." Because Joseph spoke to them through an interpreter, they thought that Joseph didn't know Hebrew. At this time, verse 21, then they said to one another, "We are truly guilty concerning our brother." Joseph asked them to bring their youngest brother Benjamin to him. It reminded them about Joseph, who they had persecuted. The 3 days in prison made them come to face the mistake that they made 20 years ago, the first time. They confessed their sin together. "We're truly guilty concerning our brother, for we saw the anguish of his soul when he pleaded with us, and we would not hear. Therefore, this distress has come upon us." They realized that they were put in the prison because they sinned against God 22 years ago. So God let the distress came upon them. We read before that Joseph was sold to Egypt and then was framed and put into the dungeon. He lived a life of suffering for 13 years until he interpreted a dream for Pharaoh and became prime minister at age 30. With the leading and presence of God, he had walked out of the suffering and became the ruler to rule over Egypt. But his brothers were still in prison. Joseph was in Pharaoh's prison, but his brother was in the prison of sin. 22 years passed. They lived 22 years of deceitful life. Very often, they had to face their old father, who was disappointed and despair because of the loss of the beloved son. They had to try to avoid this topic in their conversation because it was a dead knot in each one's heart. As long as their sins were not dealt with, they could not walk out of the prison. Although Joseph might have been suffering physically in Egypt, he walked from dungeon to palace 13 years later. But his brothers had been living in the prison of sin for 22 years and couldn't get out of it. Dear brothers and sisters, do not think that you suffer when others wrong you. When you wrong others, you also put yourself into prison of sin. In order to be set free from the prison of sin, the first step is confessing your sin. In the past 22 years, the 10 of them had never been put in a closed space together, so they could talk about and deal with their sins together. Joseph gave them this opportunity. Actually, this is similar to the prodigal son who left his home to go to a far country, mentioning in Luke chapter 15. There he wasted all his possessions, and at the end he used up all his possessions. So he had to feed swine for others. When he was hungry, he saw that the swine was eating the pots, while he didn't even have pots to eat. He came to himself. He knew that he sinned against heaven and his father. The 3 days' distress in the prison were also the time for Joseph's brothers to come to themselves. Thank God. This is God's amazing arrangement in his wisdom. They would not have come to Egypt if there was no famine. They would not have met Joseph and would not have an opportunity to face the sin that they committed 22 years ago. They had the need. In their need, God brought them to Egypt. It gave them an opportunity to face their past. From a different angle, if Jacob's house had abundance and their grains were enough for them to live through the famine, they would not have an opportunity to come to Egypt, and they would not have the opportunity to confess their sin. In fact, when Jesus talked about the parable of the prodigal son, he was facing the Pharisees, a group of self-righteous people. They thought that they had abundance. They thought that they were rich. So they could not come before Jesus humbly to be saved by grace. Knowing that we are sinner, and knowing our corrupting nature, and knowing that apart from the grace of Christ, the law, we cannot help ourselves, is the precondition to become a Christian. Church today are often filled with false Christians who are arrogant and self-righteous and have never known grace or confessed their sin. Just as the Pharisees at Jesus' time, they like to criticize others, they think themselves higher than others, and they think that they always had the truth on their side. They do not love others. Only when they had the needs, like Joseph's brothers, learn to face their past in the prison and humbly come before God, can they receive the grace of Jesus Christ. After they confess their sins, verse 22, and Reuben answered them, saying, Did I not speak to you, saying, Do not sin against the boy, and you would not listen? Therefore, behold, his blood is now required of us. What Reuben talked about here probably referred to what happened in chapter 37, verse 21. When Reuben heard that they were going to kill Joseph, he said to them, Let us not kill him, shed no blood. Later on, when Joseph was sold to the Ishmaelites merchants, Reuben was not there, so he didn't take part in it. After Joseph heard what Reuben said, he knew what happened. He actually recognized his brothers. Now that he saw that his brothers confessed the sins together, he was probably totally relieved. He had joy on one hand, but was sad on the other. Verse 23. But they did not know that Joseph understood them, for he spoke to them through an interpreter. And he turned himself away from them and wept. Then he returned back to them again and talked with them. Joseph understood their conversation during the whole time, but he acted as a quiet observer until he heard that they confessed their sins together and Reuben talking about what happened at the time. Joseph could not control himself. Joseph was a pure, righteous, and kind person. He loved his father. He loved his brothers. He planned all these to help his brothers to face what they did 22 years ago and help them to walk out of the prison of sin. Now that he saw that they confessed their sins, he couldn't help himself, but he didn't want to show his emotion in front of his brothers because he hasn't totally done dealing with his brothers yet. So he turned himself away from them and wept. Then he pulled himself together and returned to them again and talked with them. And he took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes. So the rest of the 9 brothers could return back to Canaan with the grain. But Simeon had to stay to be a hostage. His condition was that next time they came, they had to bring their youngest brother. In order to maintain his majesty in front of them, he bound Simeon before their eyes. Among Jacob's 12 sons, Reuben was the oldest. Simeon was the second oldest. Simeon was very cruel. Genesis recorded the event that Dinah was defiled at Shechem. Simeon and Levi were the ones who took their swords to kill people in the city. From their conversations, Joseph was certain that Simeon was the schemer of the whole event, so he bound him before their eyes. His brothers might be surprised. How did he know to bind Simeon? Verse 25. Then Joseph gave a command to fill their sacks with grains, to restore every man's money to his sack, and to give them provision for the journey. Thus he did for them. In appearance, Joseph was tough to his brothers, but in fact, he was full of love. He didn't want to show his emotions in front of them. When he was emotional, he turned away from them to deal with his emotion, then returned back to his brothers. He knew that there was famine at home, so grains should be sent back quickly. He gave a command to fill their sacks with grain. They brought money to Egypt to buy grain. Joseph gave a command to restore every man's money to his sack. Because Joseph was ruling over Egypt at that time, it was easy for him to take care of all these. His brothers, in a panic, finally could bring the grain home. Maybe there were maybe they were afraid that this Egyptian officer might change his mind, because he originally said to keep 9 in the prison and send one back to bring Benjamin back. But now he let go the 9 of us and only kept Simeon. This is the best out of the worst. We can imagine that they must have left Joseph's house in a hurry. Verse 26. So they loaded their donkeys with the grain and departed from there. At the beginning, they might be thinking, let's get out of here and go as far as we can. Verse 27. But as one of them opened his sack to give money, feed at the encampment, he saw his money, and there it was, in the mouth of his sack. Because they departed in a hurry, they only knew that they had the grain and had achieved their goal. They were on their journey until the night, when one of them opened his sack to give his donkey feed at the encampment. He saw that his money was still in the sack. Verse 28. So he said to his brothers, my money has been restored, and there it is, in my sack. This is the grace that Joseph gave them, but they didn't recognize Joseph. Joseph was tough to them, so when they saw that the money was still in the sacks, they were not happy. Instead, their hearts failed them, and they were afraid, saying to one another, what is that? What is this that God has done to us? Thank God, after Joseph's brothers confessed their sins, finally they had some improvement. As things happened that they didn't understand, they knew to turn to God. They knew that this was God's work, but they were not clear that what God was trying to do. Each of us was saved by the grace of Jesus Christ at the beginning. We know that we did not deserve to receive the grace, but we receive it freely. This is the first step to be saved by grace. But we didn't know God, and we only experienced a little bit of the love of Christ. We often thought that we needed Christ's grace to cover the mistakes that we had made. But for things that we haven't done, we feel that we're capable and we can depend on ourselves to live a life according to God's standard. We didn't know that we were corrupting. Neither did we know that grace was abundant. So when we experienced the extra grace from Christ, our hearts failed us and we were afraid. We didn't know what God was going to do. How many times were we like Joseph's brother? We enter the gate through Christ's grace, but we want to depend on our hard work to accomplish the salvation. 1 John chapter 4:18 reads, there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because fear involves torment, but he who fears has not been made perfect in love. If we truly know God's love, and experience God's perfect love, we will not have fear. May God help us. Let's pray together. Lord, thank you for your grace. Help us to face the sin we committed in the past, especially those sins that had been hidden deeply in our hearts, bothering us for years while we dare not reveal to others. Lord, give us grace so I can face them directly. Thank you for your perfect love. Your love fully covers all my unrighteousness, unholiness, and ungodliness. Although I don't deserve it, you love me with your eternal love. There is no regret in love. There is no fear in love. In love, we can face everything in peace. Bless my life so that it will be filled with love from you. Pray in Jesus' name.